at the moment. That's okay. Great, there it is. That's what I was waiting for. Hello, everybody. Good evening, good morning, tēnā koutou, bula, talofa lava, and hello, everybody. It's great to see all 15 of us in the call this morning, this evening. I hope we're all doing well, and it's great to see some faces. So we're going to begin a discussion on digital hate from the perspectives of young people. Being one of those people, and some of the speakers today are still relatively young people. You'll get some perspective today, which is great. And this event is all about creating safe spaces for young people and allowing us to think critically about social media and misinformation online as possibly one of the most at risk one of the most affected by misinformation on social media, because we grow up with it. Young people in rangatahi have more to say than most people, I think. And so it's great to be provided a platform in this regard. Digital technology changes the way we communicate. We build and maintain relationships with it. We set our societal standards with it, and we negotiate and assert our values. But it's also set for the spread of hate and disinformation, which turns social media and the internet in general into a hostile environment for us. We have a real good lineup of speakers today from New Zealand, London, the States, and in Fiji. And we're going to be covering a range of interesting and hopefully relevant topics. So we'll hear some stories, we'll hear some great opinions, and I'm excited to learn a lot and listen a lot. Cool. There'll be time for Q&As at the end from our attendees, so please just hold your questions until the end, and Jenna and Julie will be answering anything you guys have to say. Sweet. So that's my little spiel. So I'm going to pass it over to someone who's more handsome and talented than I am. We're going to listen to Chelsea Kane, who is the digital marketer for Transparency International. She's also a project manager for Motif. Chelsea's background in comms she is in comms, and she focuses on helping organizations to grow in an ethical manner that focuses on sustainability. She's involved in all realms of sustainability. She has a keen interest in people, in particular the rights and welfare of Indigenous cultures, and she's currently working towards her second bachelor's in Te Reo Māori at Wānanga o Raukawa. Tēnā koe, Chelsea. Let me pass it over to you.
Tēnā koe, Fletcher. Thank you so much. First of all, tēnā tātou to all who have joined us this evening. I also wanted to give a special shout out to the group of youth leaders over in Fiji who I hear are watching while enjoying some kava. So I'm very jealous, and I wish that I was there with you guys. So bula. Before we head over to our lovely speakers this evening, I just wanted to highlight the report that was done by the NZ Classification Office, and I will also post a link to the report in the comments. So this report is titled The Edge of the Infodemic, Challenging Misinformation in Aotearoa, and it has a lot of awesome information in there around the role of the internet, misinformation and trust, who intentionally spreads misinformation, as well as information on New Zealanders' attitudes and beliefs and real-world impacts. So as you all know, we're living in a digital age where widespread reliance on social media and the internet means that information can be generated and spread more rapidly. And though this could sometimes support the distribution of helpful information, it could just as easily amplify harmful messages leading to mistrust. I think here in New Zealand, some of us might feel as though misinformation isn't so widespread, and that we do quite well in filtering out misinformation from the messages that we are seeing every day. But actually, based on the report, New Zealanders not only think that misinformation is common, but they believe that the problem is getting worse, and they're quite concerned about it as well. A lot of concern is centered around important areas such as climate change or responding to the pandemic, and we don't really have to think back very far for some real world impacts on misinformation that affected us here in Aotearoa, New Zealand. And I'm sure we all remember reading articles online or seeing posts about the virus that seemed completely at odds with what we knew about the virus, such as its links with 5G telecommunication networks, or even that it was a hoax. There was also the horrific terrorist attack that was carried out on mosques in Christchurch in March 2019. And this person went to great lengths to ensure that their white supremacist ideology would reach far and wide online. And it was quite clear that he had been inspired by racist conspiracy theories. So regardless of how immune we might feel to misinformation online, everyone is affected in some way, and no one is immune from misinformation, and you can't really make assumptions about someone's vulnerability to misinformation based on things such as their age, their gender, or other characteristics. I think a lot of the time, especially me, I feel as though, you know, the older generation are maybe more prone to or more vulnerable to misinformation, but you really can't base on things such as that. So that's just some information for you to all have a think about. And I'll pass over back to Fletcher, who will be introducing you to our next speaker. So ngā mihi kia koutou.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Chelsea. She was really wonderfully paraphrasing some of the great research that was done by the OFLC. And there was a great foreword by David Shanks, the former chief censor, which says a lot about how New Zealanders see misinformation in the media. Dylan is our Māori, Samoan trauma-informed educator and is a public servant who works at the OFLC based in Te Whanganui-a-Tara. He brings frontline experience of supporting young people impacted by family and sexual violence, and he's currently a senior advisor at the Office of Film and Literature Classification, sort of my boss, and he specializes in countering violent extremism. Really excited to introduce him now. Over to you, Dylan.
Kia ora, Fletcher. Kia ora tātou. Thank you all very much for coming along today. This is a very important conversation to be a part of, and certainly I feel that personally and professionally as well. As Chelsea mentioned, we did research about mis and disinformation in Aotearoa, and the reason we could do the research is because if you don't know who the Classification Office are, we are New Zealand's media regulators. We take the law, we apply it to any sort of publication that comes into the country. Most of the time, it's the sort of things like a film or a TV show or a video game or something like that. And our job is to make an assessment about whether or not they have harmful impacts for New Zealanders, and most importantly, for young people. That's important, of course, because in New Zealand, you might see a little R16 or R13 or R18 sign on a film, and that will tell everybody who we think that this is going to be most suitable for. It's about giving information so that we can best prepare ourselves for the sorts of material that we might be looking at. Now, my area is very specific. We work with people like the police or the courts, and we look at explicitly harmful material. So the types of things that we're looking at will involve real life violence or cruelty or promotion of terrorism. And yeah, sometimes that means that we're looking at bits of information which are false or misleading, mis, dis, and malinformation. Now, part of my role is I go out into the community. I'll go to a school or to a workplace, and in one situation to a university where I was delivering a lecture or a series of lectures about the history of classification and how that worked in New Zealand. And at the end of those lectures, one of the students came down the front and introduced themselves. Now, they said that they'd really enjoyed this, and surely if we're media regulators, we could help him out with the problem that he was facing. The problem was that over the course of the pandemic, he had noticed that his father had been jumping online, going into forums, going into videos on YouTube that were telling him things that this young person knew was fake, was false, and it was starting to impact their relationship. He couldn't make it through a dinner without wanting to kick and scream and yell and just say, look, Dad, you're completely wrong, and these are the reasons why. Because if he ever tried to do that, his dad wasn't going to respond to him. It felt like it was impacting their relationship in a really real way. And all he wanted, all this young person wanted, was to know how he could preserve his relationship with his dad with all of this misinformation that was impacting them. Now, I wish that I could have turned to that person and said, this is how you do it. This is a resource. These are people that you could talk to. This is what I can do in my job to help. But the truth of the matter was, at the time that I was talking to him, I didn't have the answers to it. Not many people have the answers to that. And that's really difficult to say when I'm one of the very few people in the country who's supposed to be specializing in this type of work. It led to a moment of, well, what are we going to be doing about this? And I thought about a situation of my own, which happened just a few months before I was speaking to this young person. My own dad was in hospital. It was a very serious, life-threatening situation. He was in for 3 weeks, and we were being prepared to say goodbye to him. And I took lots of time off work and sat with him during these periods of time. And one day, it's very quiet. It's just the two of us in the room. And he turns to me and he says, "Son, have I ever told you about Agenda 21? Now I'm shocked. I'm thinking, with his very last, potentially his very last moments on this world, he wanted to use his time, his energy, to share a conspiracy theory with me. That's how important to him this piece of information was. Now I know, because this is my job, but also because I'm a young person who grew up on the internet. I could take out my phone and find the right answers. I could tell him that Agenda 21 is a conspiracy theory and is not actually going to be doing the things he's claiming to happen. I could tell him exactly where he got this information and why it was dangerous that it was shared with him in this way. I could give all the right answers, but all I could do in that moment was put my hand on his shoulder and say, "I love you, Dad. We're going to make it through here." Because ultimately, when it comes to combating mis, dis, and malinformation, what we know and what we've found out is that being right and having the right answers and telling people the right answers isn't necessarily the way to get to the truth and the way to help a person who is at risk. We need to be able to lean on our relationships. And as young people, myself included, we're the ones who hold that relationship and who are able to, through holding that relationship, help lead those around us to the right answer. Now, these stories were some of the ones that led into that research being produced. And inside the research, you'll find little anecdotes, little pieces of information, which will be helpful for if you ever find yourself in these sorts of situations yourself. Because it doesn't matter how much information you have, how much of a professional you have your expertise in your relationship and yourself. And through sharing that together is how we're going to be beating mis, dis, and malinformation. Now, I've only had a very few short moments to speak, and I'd love to engage and answer questions if you have any in the future. But I think at this point, I'm handing back to Fletcher. Kia ora.
Kia ora. You've given us a lot to think about, I'm sure, and thank you for telling us some very personal stories of how mis, dis, and malinformation, as you put it, has affected you personally. I really love that quote that you gave before that I'd love for you to expand on in future, hopefully in the Q&A. You said, telling people the answers is not how we teach them. And I really love that. I'm going to take that away, I'm sure. I'd now love to introduce Grace, who's going to be speaking to us. She is the Youth and Community Officer at Youths for Integrity, which is a network of 4,100 young people in Fiji who support integrity and anti-corruption initiatives. They are the youth network of, they're the Youth Network of Integrity Fiji, an NGO that is accredited as a national contact for Transparency International Fiji. All really impressive stuff. I'll pass over to you now, Grace.
Hello, Vinaka from Fiji. I hope everyone's doing well. I'm very honored to be joining here from Fiji. And so in Fiji, my topic would be on sextortion. One of the major issues that we face here as young people. So we here in Integrity Fiji, we offer a forum for young Fijians to think critically about social media and misinformation online. Youths for Integrity has raised the alarm over the high sextortion rates for Fiji and the Pacific. The culture of silence and the cultural taboos placed around healthy discussions of sexual issues could be contributing to the high rates of sextortion. Some young people are being targeted through personal messaging, especially through SMS, Messenger, and Viber to offer sex so as to receive government services. Corrupt people know that young victims will be too ashamed to report incidents of sextortion because it is usually the words of a vulnerable girl or boy pleaded against a powerful government official. Plus, it is fake accounts that cannot be traced to real people that makes it hard to take abuses to court. According to Transparency International, the sextortion rate in the Pacific is one of the highest recorded so far in any region of the world where the GCB surveys have been conducted. And about 38% of people surveyed in the Pacific Islands have experienced
sorry, your internet cut out there real quick.
Someone who has.
Sorry,
a
Grace,
disturbing 40% think that it
just kind of bugged out.
Is happening. It happens. Hi, sorry, you guys can hear me now?
Yes, sorry, we can. Yeah, you could just go back maybe 20 seconds. I'd love to hear all that again.
Okay. Okay. So the culture of silence and the cultural taboos placed around healthy discussions of sexual issues could be contributing to the high rates of sextortion. And some young people are being targeted through personal messaging, especially through SMS, Messenger, and Viber to offer sex so as to receive government services. Corrupt people know that youth victims will be too ashamed to report incidents of sextortion because it is usually the words of a vulnerable girl or boy pitted against a powerful government official. Worse, it is fake accounts that cannot be traced to real people that makes it hard to take abuses to court. According to Transparency International, the sextortion rate in the Pacific is one of the highest recorded so far in any region of the world where GCB surveys have been conducted. And about 38% of people surveyed in the Pacific Islands have experienced sextortion or know someone who has. And a disturbing 40% thinks that it happens occasionally in their countries. So in sextortion, sex becomes the currency of the bribe, and youths are forced into engaging in sexual acts in exchange for essential services, including healthcare and education. Communication is usually done through social media, and the sextortion rates in Fiji was at 11%, Samoa's 10%, and Tonga sits at 5%. The high regional average aligns with the high rates of sexual and gender-based violence recorded in the region, which far exceeds the global average. So ways in which Youths for Integrity can curb such issues from exceeding here in Fiji is to firstly, a person should respect the right to say no to sexual activities, speaking out against all forms of violence, which is what most youths are advocating nowadays. To educate yourself on the issue, something that we find it hard to do here in Fiji, is to actually talk about the issue, and people consider it as a taboo, like what I had mentioned already, and to admit that it do happen in our communities and we must address the issue. To also intervene if you witness any sexual abusive behavior, and to also provide awareness programs like what Integrity Fiji have been doing. And yes, that's all from my end. Thank you. And before I leave, the Youths for Integrity would like to, before I leave, the Integrity Youth would like to say Mbula to everybody. So that's all from us, Fiji. Thank you.
Thank you, Grace. And thank you, Youth for Integrity. Bula, back to all of you. It's so nice that they're standing in the background for you. And thank you for such an interesting speech. You've given us a lot to think about. And I have so many questions that I hope might be able to get addressed at the end. So thank you. And I will now, I would like to pass it over to someone who's super accomplished. Oh my goodness. Next, we have Jenna Galper, who is a member of the Centre for Countering Digital Hate's policy team. She's based in London, where she is also pursuing a Master's in Strategic Communications at King's College. Previously, she was the Senior Communications Advisor for US Congressman Adam B. Schliff. And prior to this, she managed public relations for the social justice and advocacy arm of the largest denomination of Judaism in North America. Wow. CCDH will also be sharing a presentation exploring the key drivers of online harm and misinformation using climate change disinformation as an example. The presentation will include key steps that can be taken to mitigate and reduce this harm, including greater transparency and accountability of technology companies like Facebook and Google. I am super excited to hear from you. Jenna.
Thanks, Fletcher, and thanks Dylan and Grace and Chelsea for those great presentations. I'm just going to get my screen shared here, and while I do, I just want to say how incredible it is to be able to, convene this group of young people to discuss these issues. Obviously the internet is borderless, and it creates these sort of borderless opportunities and some borderless harms that transcend nation and nationality. So it's really great to be able to discuss them together as a group. So as Fletcher said, my name is Jenna Galper. I'm on CCDH's policy team, where I consult part-time alongside my master's degree on policy and political strategy. And just a little bit more about Center for Countering Digital Hate, or CCDH. So we are an international NGO that works to counter hate and misinformation by disrupting the online architecture that enables its rapid spread and worldwide growth. And in the past couple of years since our founding, we've been at the forefront of unmasking how online platforms and search engines are driving radicalization, online harm, and misinformation. And we do both analysis and research, and then active disruption and advocacy of these networks and the folks and platforms and companies that fund them. So we champion levers for change to increase the economic, political, and social costs of all parts of this online infrastructure. So that means the bad actors who are spreading misinformation, the systems that support and spread this misinformation, and the culture that enables this sort of divisive rhetoric to flourish in our society. And this includes everything from climate change denial, sexual and reproductive health misinformation, anti-vaccine content, anti-Semitism, racism, and identity-based hate. And so today we're going to focus in specifically on climate change, which is one of the most pressing issues of our time, and one that I know you all feel the effects of deeply at home. And it's prominent in our national and international conversation, and there's a number of efforts happening at every level, from local community efforts to international multilateral efforts to figure out what we're going to do as humanity to address climate change. But one part of the climate change debate that's often overlooked is the role that misinformation plays in stopping progress on climate change. So at CCDH, we have done a number of studies on climate change disinformation. And for example, our research, the report is titled The Toxic 10, found that just 10 people are spreading the majority of baseless, unscientific climate change denial content on their own websites and across social media. And just these 10 people are responsible for 69% of all interactions with climate denial content on Facebook. Now, these are posts that distort the truth by overwhelming us with claims and questions designed in bad faith to confuse the debate on climate change, to make it hyper-partisan and difficult to achieve progress and delay us from getting to the action and the results we really need to save our planet. So you'll see here some examples of this type of climate denial content that's prevalent online and spreading on social media. And despite Facebook's promises in March 2021 that they were going to begin labeling posts that feature climate change denial with links to correct information, our research found that the platform has failed to follow through. So only 8% of the most popular posts on Facebook that contain misinformation from these toxic 10 super spreaders carried labels with correct information. That means that the remaining 92% of these posts were just allowed to gain traction on these platforms, gain virality, and poison the conversation around climate change. Now, Google is also profiting from this situation. The majority of the Toxic 10's content is funded by Google ad revenue. So whenever you go on a website and you see those sort of pop-up ads at the top or along the sidebar, every time you view or click on them, both the website is making money, but Google is making money too because they're selling that ad space. So together, the Toxic 10 generated up to $5.3 million in Google ad revenue in just 6 months that we studied them. So the Toxic 10, they're a part of an efficient climate disinformation industry, reaching 186 million followers on mainstream social media platforms. So what, right? Here's why it matters. We know that there is a clear scientific consensus that climate change is real and a real threat to humanity, and that it will have a disproportionate impact on many countries, and particularly in the Pacific. But these super spreaders of misinformation make it seem otherwise. The Toxic 10 and those who share content like them are deliberately flooding social media platforms with this content to stop us from getting to the next stage of asking what we're going to do about this global problem and how we can work together to solve it. And not only are they delaying and stopping progress, they're profiting off of it. So we started with climate change research because it's a prime example of how bad actors online, like the Toxic 10, are using and abusing social media platforms to spread their agenda, sow fear and confusion, and profit off of it. But it also shows how these platforms themselves, Facebook, Twitter, Google, and the digital infrastructure economy that underpins them, like the online advertising system, profit off of engagement and attention that harmful misinformation attracts. So I'm going to zoom out a little bit and talk about that sort of online infrastructure and ecosystem. So a handful of companies that are run by a small elite dominate the internet economy. They own the platforms and technology on which 4.5 billion people share information, form and maintain relationships, transact businesses, and conduct their everyday life and relationships. So this digital technology platforms influence every aspect of civil society and daily life. And these social media and technology companies get to decide which content wins and loses in the battle for attention on their platforms, meaning that they get to shape awareness and knowledge and the trends of the conversation for billions of people worldwide. And their algorithms aren't designed to promote healthy conversation and debate. They're designed to drive engagement to maximize their revenue. And that engagement is maximized by promoting strong emotions, sending you down rabbit holes that feed you more and more extreme content, promoting misinformation that gets sort of these strong, radical, angry reactions from people that just drives more comments and more eyeballs. And then creating algorithms that sort of feed us content that continually reinforces our beliefs. So once you read one thing that tells you that, climate change is a hoax, and it's not real and you don't need to be concerned about it, you're going to keep seeing more and more articles to that effect that just further calcify that belief for you. So these social media companies are not only creating a space for bad actors to share these dangerous opinions and dangerous misinformation, they privilege and prioritize these bad actors' content because it creates more profit for them. And we as a society are all paying the price. Now, I want to just say that, misinformation and hateful speech are by no means new. Since the dawn of history, people have misled one another to advance their own agendas, and they've sought to incite violence and hatred and confusion through their words. But what's different now in this digital era that we all grew up in as young people is the scale and frequency at which bad actors can spread these harms via social media platforms and big search engines that refuse to take responsibility for the role that they play in this harm that's created. And of course, it's not just climate change, right? Every important decision or issue that humanity has to make and face these days is impacted by what happens online. Of course, and I think as Chelsea mentioned and as Dylan mentioned, online misinformation played a significant role in the COVID crisis over the past few years. Our research at CCDH, we did a ton of looking into COVID and vaccine misinformation. And similarly, we found that just 12 individuals in their organizations were responsible for 65% of anti-vaccine content, and that they had an estimated annual revenue of $36 million US. So again, a very sophisticated and profitable industry to sow fear and confusion in ways that led people to not seek out the treatment that they needed to survive. So why it matters is these aren't just, regular people, your dad, your aunt, or uncle sharing misinformed opinions. These are sophisticated, profit-driven actors who are profiting off of fear and confusion during a crisis, and in turn, creating profit for the social media companies and the digital infrastructure who benefit from their engagement. Our research has also shown that platforms fail to act on 95% of COVID and vaccine misinformation that's been reported to them. And we found similar levels of failures to act on content related to misogynistic abuse, anti-Semitism, anti-Black racism, Islamophobia, and much more on their platforms. So our CEO likes to say when he gives these presentations that he presents, a whole bunch of really depressing information up top, and then people look at him and say, well, what are we supposed to do? And the main thing I want to say is that we're not powerless against the effects of hate and misinformation online. I know that these feel like sort of massive, intractable issues. How can young people possibly face down the power of Facebook or Google? But the first step is understanding how this ecosystem and architecture of bad actors and bad platforms works, and then organizing and advocating to disrupt them. So here's some things that we've done at CCDH, and then we'll open it up to some of your ideas of things that you think you might be able to do in your communities, or things you've seen work in your communities. So we can raise the alarm about what we're seeing on social media and demand that platforms be held accountable. For example, at CCDH, we've advocated for one of the main spreaders of vaccine misinformation in the UK, David Icke, to be deplatformed across social media platforms. And this stopped him from spreading dangerous misinformation for profit during a really critical time in the COVID pandemic. We've pressured Google to ban far-right content on its advertising platforms so that fewer people are exposed to this extremist, radicalizing, violent content. We've worked with legislators in the US and in the UK to put pressure on platforms and search engines to change their policies. So we can draw attention to the problems with bad actors and bad platforms through evidence-based research, which you can read through more of on our website if you're interested in sort of a specific issue, if you really care about misogyny and abuse against women or identity-based hate. We have research on that, and I'm happy to chat more about it in Q&A too. And we can advocate for legislative reform. So CCDH has been analyzing and influencing and talking with legislators and lawmakers across the entire world, from Australia and New Zealand to the UK and EU to the US and Canada. And we've developed this policy framework that we call the STAR framework that we believe are sort of the 4 key pillars that any legislative effort to hold big tech accountable should have. So that's S, safety by design. That means that the design choices built into these platforms prioritize the safety of its users instead of just prioritizing profit. T, transparency. So that's of algorithms, of enforcements of their rules and economics. So we, as people who are sort of living in this digital world and using these digital platforms to conduct every aspect of our lives, we deserve to know how they work. We deserve to know what kind of content they're serving us, and we deserve to know how that affects us and how they're profiting off of it. A is for accountability to democratic bodies. So again, as people, we deserve to vote for representatives, to have legislation that's democratically passed and enacted that oversees these platforms and their structures, because they have such a big impact on our life. And then lastly, R is for responsibility. So for platforms and their senior executives who've sort of gotten off scot-free as their platforms expanded and were able to just focus on profit without being held accountable for it, we think that they should be held accountable and they should be held responsible for the ways that their platform design choices and their profit models have impacted society. So I know that was a ton of information up top, and I don't want this to just be me talking at you all. So we're going to go to a little discussion activity using this tool called Menti, which I don't know if folks have used before, but basically if you either follow this link, which I believe my colleague Eva has put in the chat, or scanning this QR code if you have a smartphone. It'll take you to a page that's going to allow you to answer some questions. So I'm going to pull up that page in a minute, but I'll let this sit here for just a few seconds to let folks get in. And if you're having any issues, apologies. If you're having any issues, give a shout in the chat and I can try to help. Okay, so let me switch on over to this Q&A tool and share my screen here. Okay, so the first question, and when you all submit answers on your phones or your computer, and you can also submit multiple, so if just one person has a phone and you want to pass around, that's great. It's going to populate up on the screen as a little word cloud. So the first question is, I talked a lot about our perspective as an international organization, but we know that misinformation and hate are global problems that have sort of specific impacts in specific communities. So I'd love to hear from you guys, what do you see when you go online and what impact does that have on your community? And if this tool isn't working too, feel free to drop it in the chat and I can input it in the tool too. Fantastic. So I'm seeing discrimination, apathy, prejudice, division. It disenfranchises people, creates social outcasts, harmful ideas from family, uncertainty, isolation. Absolutely. And I think, this really speaks to the personal story that Dylan shared. I think really captures a lot of this, of just how serious the impacts are. Is there anyone who shared one of these words here that wants to come off of mute or share in the chat a little bit more about what that means to you? Maybe what discrimination you've seen, what division you've seen. Okay, if not, we can move on to the next question, but I just want to highlight some of these other interesting answers we're seeing here. So information overload, fear for the future, poor decision-making, absolutely. And I think, that really highlights some of the impacts of climate change misinformation, that you're just being flooded with all of this really confusing information that's promoting climate denialism. And it makes it difficult, for people who don't have a strong grounding in the science and don't know where to go to get accurate information. It makes it difficult to know and understand what a serious problem this is. And we certainly saw that with COVID as well. So thank you all for that one. I'm going to go to the next question. So I talked a lot about, solutions that CCDH has promoted as an organization, but obviously this has to happen at the local and at the personal level as well. Again, jumping off of Dylan's fantastic presentation, which I think we'll all be quoting for some time, it's not just about having the right information, it's about connecting and talking to people one-on-one is going to be really important in addressing this crisis. So what are some things that you think you could do to disrupt the online architecture of hate and misinformation and address its impacts in your community? That could be everything from having personal one-on-one conversations to joining a movement to taking political action or educating others. So again, you should have on your phones or your whatever device you're on the next question you can submit. You can submit your answers. Great. So I see someone's shared that they can counter with evidence-based info in gentle but relentless ways. That's fantastic, yeah. And I think it really is that persistence, but with compassion, that's so critical. Anyone else want to type something in? And if you share in the chat as well, I can input it. I see that in the chat, we have a really interesting comment that in the Pacific, climate change is perceived as God's punishment for people on Earth because of their sins, which, it's a really interesting insight and also shows how important it is to have local and community context to these issues as well, because there's different misinformation narratives can take root in different communities. Asking for facts when people put their opinion, but respecting them, that's great. Accurate sources and debunking common arguments without attacking individual believers, great. So it seems like sort of the common themes that are emerging here is sort of the dual importance of having accurate, reliable information and sharing it compassionately, which I think is really critical. And I'm glad that's sort of surfacing in the conversation. Give it a few more seconds in case anyone else wants to share something. Report those who are trolling hate, absolutely. And let me scroll so we can see. And encouraging the use of tech for good to inform people about personal carbon footprint. Yeah, fantastic. So again, you know, this presentation has talked a lot about the harms of social media, but it does provide, you know, a megaphone and an opportunity for amplification that can be used for good content too. And can seek regulation to put responsibility on social media companies. Absolutely, yes. And that's, you know, that's, as our organization, you know, our main focus is making sure that these social media companies are also accountable and, you know, primarily accountable for the ways that they spread harm and misinformation, because we as individuals can only do so much when these massive platforms and companies are profiting off of this divisive engagement. Fantastic. Well, thank you all so much for sharing that. I'm just going to put up one final slide with some information on us in case you want to see and learn any more. Oops, I have to actually share it. So again, if you're interested in these issues, you know, one way, there's so many different ways to get involved. And one way is by, you know, continuing to keep in touch with us. We have an email up here. You can post anything in the chat. We're also going to be publishing another report on climate change later this year and would love to have all of your support, especially if this is an issue that you care deeply about. And one thing you can do if you want to be part of sort of this upcoming work that we're doing is by emailing a video about why you think it's important to address climate misinformation online. So if anybody's interested in that, we can connect further afterwards. So thank you. And thank you again for all those really interesting and insightful answers. And with that, I'll hand it back over to Fletcher.
Wonderful. That was really great, Jenna. Thank you for a well-organized presentation and some involvement. It's really great to hear from our attendees and the people in the chat as well. It's great to get them involved because we will shortly be hearing from them in our Q&A. But first, before we get to that, I'm going to pass it over to Eva Hartshorn-Sanders. She's based in Washington and is, DC, that is, Washington, DC, and is the head of policy at the Center for Countering Digital Hate. As the head of policy, she's working on legislative reform, partnerships, and political education. In her previous life, Eva was a key advisor in the New Zealand government's response to the Christchurch mosque terrorist attacks. She has also worked with the UN on a climate change and space technology project in the Pacific and as senior legislative and political advisor in the UK House of Lords. Wow. Okay, Eva, we would love to hear from you on our next steps and actions in countering digital misinformation.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me. I think I'm actually joining Jenna to answer any Q&As for this part of the session, but so happy to open that up now as well. So I think there was a question in the chat earlier, wasn't there? In the Pacific, climate change is perceived, oh no, not that one. There was one a bit earlier. About different age groups being impacted by COVID misinformation. I think that's consistent. It's not any one age group or any one ethnicity or other characteristic. Like misinformation and disinformation can impact people across the board. And so it's important to have like safety and protections there for a broad range of users as well. There is like legislative efforts happening overseas, like in the UK, where there's additional safety obligations that apply in relation to children and ensuring that they're not exposed to harmful content in the same way that we would in New Zealand with having like labels for content that might be suitable for 18 or over. or like ensuring that particular types of harmful content like eating disorder content or suicide content, that they're not exposed to that content too young. Jenna, did you want to add anything to that question?
No, I think, Eva covered it mostly. I think, there's been detailed research in sort of different specific country contexts that look at the different ways that, people by age process and respond to misinformation. So I don't know, particularly in the Fiji context, I know I've seen research, particularly about the UK, that showed that younger people and older people are similarly vulnerable to misinformation, but that younger people tended to be, there was sort of a quicker pathway to convincing them towards accurate information, that if you were younger, maybe it's easier to sort of correct the record, and that it's more of a challenge with older folks online who tend to sort of believe the first thing they read, and it's more difficult to sort of break that down. But again, that was UK specific research. So I think there's sort of broad trends, and then it's important to have, people looking directly into communities and making sure we have very like evidence-based and specific research on a specific community.
So please feel free to put any additional questions that you might have into the chat as well.
Just while we wait for questions to come in from our attendees, I have one for Jenna. I'd like to hear a little more perhaps about the process behind deplatforming David Icke. I don't know much about him, but I've seen people like him getting pushed off the internet in the past, and I want to know kind of the process that your group took to get that, to make that happen.
Yeah, that's a great question. So unfortunately that happened before I joined CCDH, but I can speak to it somewhat, and maybe Eva can jump in as well. But essentially our model that I touched on a little at the beginning is about creating sort of political, economic, and reputational costs. So what that means, because that's kind of like jargony, is that basically we want to make it political costs means holding platforms politically, legally accountable for when they enable misinformation to spread. So, a platform that allows somebody like David Icke to profit off of massive vaccine misinformation should face legal accountability. And we've been pushing for, legislation globally on that. Economic means, focusing on the advertising industry. So raising awareness about, how harmful this content is and how it's funded by Google ads and other systems that, brands might not even know that their ads are appearing and promoting this content. So making it, too expensive and too costly for Google ads to, continue operating in the way that they do, because brands don't want to be associated with dangerous vaccine content like David Icke. And then reputational, and that's something, I think we really focused on with a lot of our COVID and anti-vaccine misinformation, which is, really raising the alarm about how prevalent this was, how dangerous it was, how it was leading to, not just divisiveness and angry discourse about COVID, but people getting very sick and even dying because they believed that the vaccine wouldn't save them or that it was dangerous. And so they didn't take it. And they, tragically, we had a life-saving vaccine and people were not able to access it. So by creating those sort of reputational costs and pressuring platforms and making them feel that they were going to face, economic, legal, and reputational accountability if they didn't take action on it, we were able to, pressure them into suspending and blocking him from various major platforms. And Eva might be able to know more about the specifics of this process as well, though that also happened before she joined the organization too. So
no, that's true. I think it was a huge campaign. So it was backed by evidence-based research that we were able to share with key decision makers, and then also get a lot of media attention around as well. Our organization has worked a lot with health professionals too, to kind of raise awareness. Because this impacts GPs, it impacts specialists. The whole healthcare system is impacted by COVID disinformation. This particular person, David Icke, had been a long-standing hate disinformation campaigner, and COVID was his latest issue that he kind of added to that mix, because he's running a business, and a business based on disinformation. And so really like going after the economics of that business model, that's part of our theory of change at CCDH as well. People shouldn't be profiting from disinformation, especially harmful disinformation, which is killing millions of people. So there was a moral case to be made there, and it was supported by the research that we'd done. We've got some more questions coming through. Gina, do you want to pick the next one?
Sure. I saw two great questions on resources specifically for the Pacific and for teachers. I don't know if some of our other speakers might want to address this question from Angela. What support is there in the Pacific region with education for children and young people? Are there any agencies to report to? Maybe Dylan or Chelsea might be able to weigh in on that, but it'd be great to discuss some resources.
And just to add that, we've put our web link in there as well. So on the climate change ones, you can actually sort by climate change research on our website. And there's additional information and blogs on there as well.
Yeah. Excuse me. When I was speaking earlier and talking about the landscape and the lack of research and resources that were available, that was looking at 2020, 2021. And so now we're in the zone of creating those resources and putting them out there. The research from our office, which was released in May of 2021, was the first of a tranche of work, which is going to be translated into this as well. Part of the reason why the resources are so thin on the ground is because the tools that we have available to us in terms of legislation and the rest isn't really fit for purpose for dealing with mis and disinformation. And I'm skipping to another question which I saw there as well about, could we ban or could we block this sort of material? What does censorship look like in this area? In terms of the tools that we have available for us at the moment, we are only looking at the most harmful, the most seriously promotional, the most, we're using words like terrorism and violent extremism, when we're looking at the sorts of things that we ban. A lot of this material around mis and disinformation as a government, it gets really tricky for us to wade into that conversation about banning that, because there are really severe implications on the freedom of speech and expression. And we aren't necessarily the best people to weigh in on that debate when it comes to this, because what we have is the equivalent of a legislative sledgehammer with really severe penalties. But what there is really good promise for in the future is change and new tools becoming available to us. There is legislative reform, there are new organizations starting and more powers being given to existing organizations so that these tools can be produced. And importantly, recognition that we can be providing more funding for the production of more resources in this area as well. So there is an amount of watch this space and see how this develops, but also there is opportunity to put pressure on and encourage our governments to be more proactive in producing resources for our communities as well.
Just to add to that, just very quickly, on an individual level, when you see a post that comes up that might have climate disinformation or COVID disinformation on it or something hateful, the temptation there is to kind of, say something about it, or, put on like a sad crying face or something like that, or an angry face. But actually what that will do is amplify it further. It'll mean it'll go to people that are following you, it'll give oxygen to that disinformation or that hate content. So it's what we call don't feed the trolls. Basically, we've got a resource on our website about that as well. But I think it's just important in thinking about how you deal with the content that that's the way the platforms are designed, and that's the engagement model that they're profiting from. So blocking the content at an individual level, like reporting the content, those are still really viable options for like stopping it rather than adding fuel to that fire.
I had a question for Grace. This is Julie here. I had a question for Grace. I wondered what's needed in Fiji to reduce sextortion in online situations. You know, what is there any regulation or legislation, or is it a community thing? Is it people talking to each other? What's going to be the most important thing? Because it's such a serious problem.
Hi, Julie. For your question, maybe to have more education for the public in terms of advocating more integrity and anti-corruption by having stronger regulations, because we don't have that at the moment.
Probably have time for maybe one more question if there was any burning last question that someone wants to throw in.
I think there was a question here about freedom of speech.
Oh yes, I see. Julie asked, what about the free speech argument? Should we not just let it, all be unrestricted online? I think that's the hot question on this issue, right? And it's one that's sort of being debated within the political context of each country and globally. Sort of one thing that I think helps contextualize it a bit is when you think about free speech. You think about like what does it actually mean to be free to speak and express yourself, and free speech for whom, right? So, like I said, we're all existing and communicating and connecting online, right? But if every time I go online, I'm being faced with a barrage of, sexist and harassing direct messages, or I'm, seeing anti-Semitic posts and images and videos, I don't really have free speech to express myself online anymore, right? And if there is the right to free speech, obviously, but there's not the right to have your specific speech, amplified and to profit off of it online. So I think sort of when we talk about free speech as this like big concept, well, of course, we all want to protect free speech. It's a pinnacle of democracy. But when you look at it a little more granularly, what kind of speech are we actually talking about here? And we're talking about speech that is harassing, inciting, dangerous, misleading people, and that there are industries profiting off of it. And that's really what we're focusing on here. I don't know if anyone else wants to weigh in on that, because I think that's a really big, important issue.
In New Zealand, and there's, it's a balance. So like it's free speech that's protected to the extent that it's reasonably practicable in a free and democratic society. So like when you look at some of the speech that is harmful that we've covered in our studies, like speech from extremism that leads to extremist events, like the Capitol attack on January 6th in the US, or like the live stream footage of the Christchurch mosque terrorist attack, like that's not protected speech within like how we would understand that law to operate. And it's a reason why in New Zealand, like with the Christchurch mosque live stream, for example, a decision was made that that wasn't a lawful content, and it's incredibly harmful. And what we've seen is that that content has been shared overseas and has led to other extremist attacks. So like it's an incitement type content that is incredibly harmful in that situation. Dylan, did you want to add to that?
I mean, yeah, you covered that very well. Of course. I made a reference before about having a necessarily high bar for content that we want to take action against or ban, because we're really concerned about, first and foremost, in that balancing act, protecting our freedom of speech and expression. Really important that New Zealand doesn't really have freedom of speech as much as we do freedom of expression, and that's what we might commonly talk about as freedom of speech is an idea that we have imported from another country and from another country's laws and practices and constitution. So often when we have that conversation about freedom of speech in somewhere like New Zealand, we can get really muddy about what is actually protected and entrenched for us and what is part of a culture that is being imported from elsewhere.
Perfect. Well, it seems like those are our questions for this evening, and because it's just gone on 7:30, an hour has really flown by, it's time for us to wrap up. I'd like to thank all of our speakers individually for contributing some amazing things to this conversation. Dylan speaking about the OFLC's background, his role, sharing some personal stories about how conspiracies impacted him personally, giving us some amazing quotes like legislative sledgehammer, which I will now be using for all of eternity. And providing us, and to Chelsea as well, providing us with the OFLC's misinformation research, which I would strongly recommend you guys go check out. It's really interesting to see. We also heard from Jenna, who shared with us some amazing presentations and spoke on climate change. So we heard a range of resources about far-right extremism, climate change, and sextortion in Fiji. So I'd like to thank Grace as well and the Integrity for Youth people who have graciously joined us from across the city today. And really, so I'll just wrap this up because we're already over time, but thank you all so much for being here, and you can feel free to trickle out in your own time or stick around if you're a panelist and you want to ask any of our amazing panelists any other questions. But thank you to our attendees. Kia ora, have a good one. How good. I think we are out. No more attendees.
Cool.
That was fantastic. Ah, you all did so well.